Good afternoon. My name is Hillary Hall. I'm your Boulder County Clerk and Recorder. It's my privilege to be the moderator here today. Today is April 5th, 2016. Today's panel is panel number 2465, and the topic is Money is Speech, but is anyone buying? And our panelists today, I'll introduce them in order. Our first panelist is Mary G. Wilson, and she's the immediate past president of the National League of Women Voters. And this is her first conference on world affairs. So everyone, be polite and generous with your support. I'm going to introduce all the panel, and then I'm going to tell you how to ask questions, and then we'll jump in. Our next panelist is Michael Frank, a veteran of Conference on World Affairs. He's with the Heritage Foundation and is a national policy leader. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. And our final panelist is Arunya Kalayam, and she serves on the Democratic Tax Council for the House Ways and Means Committee. And this is also her first Conference on World Affairs, so show her what a great audience we are. With that in mind, remember, we're here to hear new points of views, be respectful. We all know our opinions, and to keep objections or spontaneous hisses and other inappropriate sporting-like activities out of the room. People come here on their own. They travel on their own expense and volunteer their time, and they are invited guests, and so I'm sure we'll all treat them as such. So this year, I have a message to read, and we're hoping that this will be working for us. Audience questions for this panel will be submitted via text. This is a trial format. It's motivated by a desire to allow for our online audience to participate in the Q&A period, and by a desire to improve the overall quality of Q&A for the Conference on World Affairs. So to participate in text question submission, you'll first need to join this session. So if you think you might want to ask a question, I'm going to go through the process real quick, so go ahead and take out your smartphone. And if you don't think you're going to join, make sure you have silenced it already. If you're going to join, what you need to do, and the numbers and instructions are up on the wall as well, is you send a text message to 3760, and in the body of the text, you type UMC 235, and you'll get a confirmation message. And you need to type it just as it's written. Now, those of you who are not going to join us with text questions, the producers will be resolving this as we're talking. The producers will be handing out note cards, and if all else fails, we'll go back to the old-fashioned microphones. But the goal here is to help facilitate how the questions are asked and allow for online participation. All right, well, with that housekeeping out of the way, Mary, why don't you go ahead and start us off?
All right, thank you. See, I had the problem of being a little bit late coming to join the other panel members, so naturally, he who is late gets to go first. Let me first of all say that I'm not speaking on behalf of the League of Women Voters today. I will be talking about some of the concepts and principles that the League supports, but just in case I make some partisan remark, you'll know that I'm not speaking on behalf of the League today. Let me just start by saying that you all know Citizens United. You've heard that case name so many times. And everyone blames Citizens United for the big money that is in the political races today. Well, I have to tell you that I think Citizens United is getting just a kind of a bum rap by being pinned with responsibility for contributing so much to the concept of the money that's flowing into politics. Yes, the Supreme Court didn't do us any favors by saying that corporations had the right to free speech. But the fact of the matter is that for many, many years, campaigns have become more expensive. in large part because of the huge amount of television advertisement and the high expense. So we've had a concept for a number of years, even before Citizens United, of a lot of money flowing into the political races. So don't be so quick to blame everything on Citizens United. And that's a shorthand way of saying you may want to think twice, 3 times, 4 times before you jump on the bandwagon of, oh, let's have a constitutional amendment to fix this problem. Because always when you're talking about a constitutional amendment, you are talking about the most extreme kind of a measure to fix an issue, and you might be very sorry about the end product that you get out of that. So there are lots of different ways that we can all work towards reforming the system to ease this little situation that we have of money flowing into the political process. One of the ways that you may not be familiar with is to work through the Federal Election Commission, which has become kind of a demoralized entity, if I may say so, with not having a full commission for a number of years and so forth. But they are the group that really and truly could give us some stronger definitions about the question of what does it mean for a political action committee to be coordinating with a campaign. They could define the word coordination to include some of the concepts that have come out of some of the cases, to suggest that the functional equivalent approach of if a advocacy group is proposing and putting out money and advertisement in the name of advocacy on an issue, if they're too closely tied to a candidate, there are restrictions on them being unable to coordinate with the political campaign during certain periods of time. And so if we had a better definition coming out of the FEC about what coordination really means, we probably would have less of a problem in terms of advocacy money really being used to support particular candidates. There's also the word independent expenditures, the concept of being that independent expenditures can't be used for the supporting candidates during certain periods of time, and if the FEC would identify and define the word independent, we might also see some improvements there. Congress has attempted also to do some things after Citizens United. You may have heard of a statute, of an act, I should say, it hasn't passed, called the Disclose Act. It would go a long way in terms of informing all of us voters when we hear those advertisements that are sponsored by political action groups. It would go a long way to inform us about who's behind those. And especially entities like labor organizations or nonprofit organizations, advocacy organizations, and entities like the Chamber of Commerce. It would require certain disclosures of major donors. It also would require that corporate reports of some corporations have to disclose to their shareholders how much money they spent and what they spent it on as far as political advocacy is concerned. So that's one way that Congress can be involved in terms of tightening up the process to show that You know, when I talk to people about money in politics, almost every person that I talk to, no matter what the political stripe, thinks there's way too much money in the political races. And one of the trends that hasn't really developed but is maybe on the back burner once again is public financing of elections. And we have some state laboratories, if you will, that have tried some public funding for some of their statewide races with some success. And so that may be yet another way where we at the state level can advocate to take and limit the amount of money that is in politics and the influence that the people behind the money ultimately have. So all is not grim in the world of money in politics. Thank you.
Thanks. Mike?
Good afternoon, everyone. It is afternoon, right? Okay.
Yes.
I have 3 panels and a political science class to talk to today. So if I'm what topic again here? It's great to be back, and I always love coming to this conference and seeing all my my good friends in indigenous Boulder. So it's good to see all of you. Let me try approaching this a little bit differently. My suggestion is to sort of move up to about 30, maybe 50,000 feet. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that the amount of money in politics bears a direct relationship to the size, scope, and reach of what the government does or tries to do. The regulatory cost, which is there's a study that measures this periodically from going back to the early 1990s. When it first did this, if you compared the total cost of regulations early 1990s, which I think in inflation-adjusted dollars is about $800 billion a year, was roughly, I think at the time, something like 40 cents on the dollar to every dollar raised by the IRS. You get fast forward to 2012, with the most recent time they've done that study, and the cost is a little bit over $2 trillion a year, again, adjusted for, these are apples-to-apples numbers, and that's about 80 cents on the dollar of what the IRS has raised, and these individual income tax as the example. So the regulation's getting bigger and bigger. There's more agencies, there's more regulators, there's more pages in the Federal Register, there's more activity that affects more people, it affects more private businesses, it affects pretty much everybody, the state and local governments, higher institutions of higher education, and so on. And I guess my simple proposition is that if you want less money in politics, you may want to have less government activity in all these spheres. I can guarantee you if tomorrow the federal government wanted to regulate kite flying, there would be more, not less money spent in politics at some increment. And that would be because people who want to fly kites without intrusion from government would form some kind of a group, they'd raise money, they'd support people, and they'd get involved because that's the way the system works. As a conservative, I'm frustrated at what I think is corporate welfare and the way corporations come in and manipulate the system. I'm frustrated with the way labor unions do that. I'm frustrated with the way institutions of higher education do that. Yeah, I get frustrated, right? But it's not so much because these institutions and these entities are doing things that they shouldn't be doing. They're just acting completely in a predictable and natural way, given that someone out there in the government is regulating and intruding into their lives or their activities in a way that they may not like, or they may not be doing enough of something. So they come in and they petition the Ways and Means Committee or any committee on the Hill and say, you know, we need this little tweak. And I'll share one story with you that I actually like because I think it applies to a lot of different things. Article written about 15 years ago by the former director of the Medicare and Medicaid programs, a guy named Bruce Vladeck. He served under Bill Clinton, expert in healthcare, and he wrote about his reflections on what he learned in all that time. And one of the points he raised is that he was thoroughly surprised at the extent to which every nook and cranny of the extensive Medicare program, and it was a lot less extensive then than it is now, believe me, has spawned its own little cottage industry. There are trade associations around every single disease group, every single category of providers, every single category of hospitals, every single pharmaceutical product that's out there, and they all want to be covered. They will want to be reimbursed at a higher level. They all want to be getting equity with some other category of recipients. And they come and they lobby the agencies and they lobby Capitol Hill day and night. Okay, it's the Medicare program spawns that. There's probably more, if you were to measure it, more of that regulation today than yesterday, and more than certainly when Bruce Vladeck wrote that piece. He dubbed it the Medicare Industrial Complex. And if you think about it, there's an industrial complex for education, for housing, for transportation, for you name it, everything. Defense is where Eisenhower came up with the term, right? But it's beyond that, and so that's the source. That's the reason why there's an incentive for more and more money to go in. People don't want to waste their dollars frivolously, but there's so much at stake, and this is why judicial nominations have spawned a lot of money in politics, because courts now are rewriting laws in ways that suddenly the outcome of a court case is going to determine the future of an entire industry, perhaps, even though Congress never maybe intended to do that way. So what happens when there are nominations for court, whether it's the Supreme Court, federal appeals courts, or district courts? Organizations form and they evaluate and vet these candidates and these nominees, and money is spent, pro and con. Okay, and it's because the courts have become more powerful, relatively speaking. So I think it all gets back to the nature of late 20th century, early 21st century government, what it does, what it tries to do, what it aspires to do, and every single time there's one of these changes or proposals, people line up. Each team lines up and spends a lot of money. One of my really best friends is someone you'll probably know the name of. He spent about $50 to $100 million in the last election cycle on a certain issue, right? And I don't think it helped. I think the Republicans did very well in the places where he spent most of his money. And I told him thank you for that, but it didn't work. But I want him to be able to do that if that's what he chooses to do. He believes very, very strongly in that issue, and he should be able to spend his fortune doing what he wants to do in that regard, and I don't begrudge him that. I like disclosure, and I think you should find more and more disclosure is good, and I think the agencies can encourage a whole lot more of disclosure on the part of their regulated areas as well, and transparency is always, I think, a good tonic and a good source of information for citizens to make evaluations about what's going on. So at that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Before we go to our next speaker, the session is now working. So if you want to start texting, let us know. And then if you need note cards, our producers will come around with those as well. So thanks. We got that.
Okay, great. Can you hear me? Is this good? Okay, thank you. I think I'm, at least presently, the only person with a .gov behind her email address. So I have to give you my little disclaimer that my remarks are mine and my own. And I don't speak on behalf of the Ways and Means Committee or the Ways and Means Committee Democratic members. So with that out of the way. I'd like to sort of propose a different idea here. So if we're talking about Mike's friend that just spent $50 to $100 million on an issue or on an election regarding an issue, what if I were to turn that around and say it wasn't Mike's friend that was spending any of his assets, it was you guys who are spending your assets? Most of this, when you're talking about big dollar contributions, and I can say this in a way that I think most people in this room, if you're locals, can probably relate. I'm a DC native. I'm from the area. It is a very, blue, red, purple area and a very expensive media market. Okay, so come election time, you see an unreal amount of television advertising. I assume the same is here, being in a Denver market. These are highly competitive races, and they're fighting for seats, and you get the same inundation of advertising. Now, what if I were to take that and say, convert that to what you guys are paying out of your assets? So I'll call it, you're paying out of your personal time, your family time, your attention span, possibly your neighborliness, because I don't know where your neighbor's going to be if they like that vitriolic ad more than you like this one. I think decorum takes a hit. I think even just interpersonal relationships on things like social media or Facebook take a hit. These are all things that you are giving up because of the dollars coming into this system in this way. And it's one of those, I think that if you go back and look at it, I mean, when October happens, that's like, so we're like we're in the build up to the crazy period in Washington, I would say. We're not quite there yet. You know, and then the conventions happen, and then the gloves come off, and you get the real surrogate fighting and all of that. And then October is when the full assault comes on. You really don't even want to turn on your TV, and you're sick and tired of hearing these people's names, and I approve this message and all that stuff. That's when things get weird. And then this whole idea that you're spending you on this whole thing. Finally, you stop hemorrhaging on November 9th after the election on November 8th. And if that's something that makes you uncomfortable, in a lot of ways, it makes me uncomfortable. Now, don't get me wrong, I live in Washington, D.C. We know the political leaning of the district, and we don't really get a vote in Congress, so we kind of know where we are. But in these areas where it matters a lot, it's up to you guys to decide. I don't want to hemorrhage these parts of my personality or my family or my time anymore. And I think that's how you guys can come up and say, it's this money in our system that can drive the spending of all of these things. The way I would look at it is, your members, your elected officials will listen when you tell them you're tired of spending on these things that are yours. And I know families and friends and things that it's amazing how it's gotten to this point, but they do get torn up. And even of my friends that are all Democrats, the Bernie versus Hillary it's vicious, vicious. The number of people are like, oh my God, block, unfriend, whatever. And some of it I'm like, oh my God, everyone's insufferable right now, frankly. But I'm like, November 9th comes and everything's good again. So I would propose that the spending isn't just actual dollars coming in. The voting citizenry has a very large role in all of this money flowing around, and I think that there's a lot of control that the voting citizenry can exert in changing that. I would like to just do a strong support of things like the Disclose Act. I think that there's a lot of people that would like to overturn Citizens United. I'm one of them. But I would say a constitutional amendment is a very heavy lift, number one, and there is a lot that can be done before you get to that point. And I think that, sunshine kills a lot of germs. If you know exactly who is contributing what, and I'd like to, if I were to be, the next Vox.com or whatever, pair that together with a voting record. I'd want to see all of that together. And some very smart person in Silicon Valley is going to do that, or probably has already done that, but without as much disclosure. But if you can see all of those things lined up, I think that empowers people who are actually going to be electing these people to make the decision they want to make, as opposed to hiding behind these big dollar, super PACs or advertising campaigns that really are just an assault on your time. So I think with that, I'll turn it open to questions.
Okay, thanks. First, if the panel had any. Moving us along. Does the panel want to respond to anything that was said? All right. Great. We have one question on the tablet, which is now, and the question didn't quite get completed. So I'm going to recommend we go old-fashioned and let's get the microphones out, because, let's do the microphones, because I have a feeling there's probably more of you that want to ask a question than want to text it in, I'm hoping. And we have some cards. Okay. Are they, and we don't have any filled out yet, right? So let's just, if I can, let's just go to the microphones, and because I have one partial question that it looked like it was too long for the text, so we'll go back old school and make your way up. And students, as usual, please come forward. We'd love to hear from you. And I have one question while they're resetting that I will ask to the panel. And then that way, again, so if you would just, we're going to go ahead and go use the microphones. We're going to go off the high-tech process, but apparently we're going to do both. So I'm going to read this and then I'll go to the microphone. All right. If most of the money spent in the campaign goes to TV advertising, where does the money go eventually? Does it end up in the coffers of the majority stakeholders of the 5 media companies who control that medium?
Yes.
That's good.
And the consultants. The consultants get, you guys may know this more than me, I think double-digit percentages of all the ad buys. So there's an enormous amount of transfer of money from interests that want to affect some outcome, whether it's an election or a policy fight, and the consultant class.
Yeah, I think the broadcasters in general, as a group, have a very strong lobby in Washington and an active role in our political system.
Great. Let's go over to the microphone, and we'll keep the cards coming too. We'll just.
Hi, very simple question. The quote about the military-industrial complex, I'm seeing more and more of it referred to as the military-industrial congressional complex. How do you guys feel about that?
Well, I thought he was talking about the Medicare industrial complex, if I'm right. And
Any of the
but in all honesty, I think
Congress,
I would, when Mike was talking about the Medicare industrial complex, and possibly, in my mind, the way I see it is, okay, or at least the way I interpreted what you said, Mike, was, if you want smaller money in government, get a smaller government. Mm-hmm. Well, what I would say to that is, okay, where do you want to start? You want to start with the biggest money in government right now in the military industrial complex? I think it's a fair point. And I would say, oh, certainly. Mm-hmm. But I would say if I don't think they're related. It's the biggest dollars. It's where very critical votes come from. I think that it's important to look at what the size of that you want it to be, and talking to your elected officials to tell them that that's not the size of something you want. I would posit that Medicare, obviously Medicare's gotten a lot bigger. Our population's getting older, and it's going to get a lot older in the next 10 years. This is some of that. You'll say, sure, it's because of consultants that want to talk about end-stage renal disease, but some of it is because all of our grandparents are getting there. My parents are there, and it's at this point you're like, okay, this baby boomer generation. Talk about the next 30 years. People can say Medicare is exploding. It's like, yeah, that's the demographics of our population. Next question. That's how I sort of see it.
Yeah, but your point's a good one, sir. I think that there's a number of ways you could say provide health coverage for senior citizens or collect revenue in the tax code. One version of which could be as clean and simple and as like take a flat tax model where you basically pay a percentage that's known in advance. There's few, if any, deductions, and it's you can fill it out on one page, and it's simple, right? The amount of lobbying that would go on relative to the tax code would be a lot different, if any, because it would be trying to get things back into the code. You can design a tax code to raise that money and have it be a couple 100,000 pages, have multiple exclusions and special provisions, and people lobby for those provisions so they can make a living, right? And so every time you make the code, whether it's the tax code, the healthcare code, you name it, more complicated, you're creating more leverage points for all these different interests to come in and get a special deal. And that in turn generates a higher lobbyists, they hire form trade associations, and many times they engage directly in the political process. So I think, one other way, when I say less government, I don't necessarily mean dramatically less in the way of spending. I mean that it's simpler and less subject to all those points of entry by all the different interests.
Thank you.
And let me just say, I had never heard the congressional part of that tacked on to the military-industrial complex. At one time in my career, I worked in the military-industrial complex, and I kind of think maybe that's a good thing to tack that Congress on there, because we fat cats in the military-industrial complex wouldn't have had any money if it hadn't been for Congress appropriating. So if you don't mind, I'm going to use that phrasing from now on.
Great. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the student, because students have some preference, and then I have a few student questions, and then we'll go on. So the texting's up, fully working. If you want a card, raise your hand. We'll get you a card. But
tip it over. Just tip it over.
Yeah. Just do it like a lounge singer. Lean it over. Get your inner rock star on.
So my question was, you said that legislation like the Disclose Act hasn't passed Congress. What do you think we could do to get legislation through Congress, and what would those acts have to look like?
Form a political action committee. You spend a lot of money on TV ads. No, I'm only kidding. You build up the number of co-sponsors. You get very sympathetic people to walk around and educate staff and then members on what's in the bill and why it's important. You get some intelligent people to write essays or op-eds or whatever to back it up. You get some newspapers to say, good idea, and you try to create momentum.
And then you get the leadership to decide to put the bill on the floor.
Yeah.
I mean, that is, you can have everything that Mike just described, and then leadership won't put it on the floor. You know, so you gotta, that sort of momentum is going to be important. And I would say the other part's that, and thankfully is not, I actually don't think is as complicated with this issue. I think you have to have bipartisan support if you want something like this to go through in a meaningful way.
That's incredibly important.
And all of this adds up to, it'll help a great deal if everybody votes, because nothing will diminish the power of big business in influencing Congress like us voting and showing that we are the ones that matter.
Thanks. I have a few student questions here. We're going to go with the one here. What are your thoughts on how the Supreme Court vacancy affects money in politics and whether Citizens United may be overturned?
I mean, I did try to address that in the sense that I think when courts get involved in more and more things and had more and more of a say in the final resolution of some policy debate, some way law is going to be interpreted and oftentimes expanded, then the stakes get higher. And more people want to have their voices heard with respect to any kind of nomination for almost any level of federal court, and it only goes up. The more the courts get engaged like that, the more likely you're going to see these high-stakes battles. And it goes back, 40 years at this point, and it's become institutionalized right now. To the point where this whole organization set up, people have acquired pensions because they've worked in these organizations for a long time, and those organizations aren't going away anytime soon unless the jurisprudence starts to change dramatically.
I guess just briefly, I think Citizens United, in my opinion, and Mary, I think I'm going to disagree with this, I think it actually was a big case. I think it was very big and very significant, and the grounds on which the ruling was based. Before coming out here, I decided to read the opinion again, just to go back and take a look. And if it's not something you've done, I urge you all to do it, just to sort of see what was the rationale behind where the justices came to an agreement. I'm trying to think of, the campaign finance cases that are coming up in the courts and the very small handful that make it to the Supreme Court. They're really unique, and I would like to, and I'm very curious as to what the case could look like that would bring up a reconsideration of Citizens United. Trying to play that out in my head, who might that be? I don't have that yet. But for a number of other reasons, I think it's important to confirm a Supreme Court justice before the end of this year, or as soon as possible.
Yeah, I don't necessarily see it being overturned, but I'm like you. If you haven't read Citizens United opinion, please do, especially the dissenting opinion. It's one of the funniest opinions I think I've ever read. I mean, really and truly. I mean, honestly, funny, ha ha, funny. But the concept is that it would take a lot to overturn that, and one of the reasons I think it would take a lot to overturn it is because the Supreme Court probably wouldn't take the case that would be the prime one to overturn it. It would take not only a lot of orchestrating down at the lower court level to bring a case up to overturn it, and then when you got to that level, I'm not sure that the Supreme Court would even take it.
Okay. One more question, and then I'll go to the microphone over there. It's a student question. So why do you think the amount of money in politics has increased when the cost of digital goods has only gone down? For example, it costs almost nothing for a candidate to have a Facebook page.
Consultants.
I was wondering if it was the same answer. Yeah.
I would agree with that. And you're not just advertising on TV. You're advertising on your Facebook pages, on all your other social media platforms. In some ways, Facebook is free, but to buy the ads on Facebook, those are all part of this. So you've actually just created more mediums.
And it takes money and consultants to drive people to your Facebook page or your Twitter feed and that sort of thing. So it is just a function of the expense of getting your word out there.
So also, per the earlier question, who profits from all this money? I think Facebook is a large profiteer in this.
Interesting. Great. Okay, let's go to microphone over there. Great.
I would like to know if any of you have read, and I strongly suggest everybody read this book. I just finished Dark Money by Jane Mayer. It's Dark Money, the hidden, the hidden history behind the billionaires, the rise of the radical right, that have funded the rise of the radical right. That's almost the title, but anyway, it's very, very eye-opening. Very informative, and it'll get your blood boiling. Anyway, have any of you read it? It's amazing.
Yeah. I will say I have not read it, but it was the first thing I talked about with the couple I am staying with out here when I got in on Saturday night. No joke. So it is literally next up on my Kindle reading list. So it was one of the first things, and we talked about some, particular people that they kind of go into, and I think there are ramifications to her reporting and things like that. Just so. I absolutely. Not yet. Is that it? That's my fair answer. Have I read it? Not yet.
Okay. Thanks. I have a question for Mike. If wealthy individuals should be able to spend huge amounts, how does the average person have influence?
Bernie Sanders campaign. A lot of campaigns, you can raise money now in smaller increments, and the money can go very far. And also, I guess I question the efficacy of a lot of the spending. I do think that, like many other endeavors involving government, these efforts to micromanage people's behavior and all that in the voting booth don't always work. In fact, a lot of times they backfire. George Bush had raised 100 plus. Not George. Jeb Bush raised over 100 million, I think, for his PAC. He blew 30 million tracking Marco Rubio, and he got out of the race. And all these people were left asking, how did you fritter away all that money and for what purposes, right? So the money in politics, it's not as if there's a direct correlation between amount spent and efficacy. In fact, a lot of times it's the other way around.
Okay. Anybody else wanted to respond? Oh, specifically for you, but.
I'll just say that it is kind of interesting that there are statistics all over the place as to whether or not some of the big money spending works or doesn't work to influence public opinion. I have this jaded viewpoint that says, if it didn't work, why would they be spending those big amounts of money?
Okay, question from the floor?
So I'm curious, most of you guys have been talking about TV advertising, and while that's definitely the big medium of the 20th century, I don't think it'll continue into the 21st. And I'm curious what sorts of right to privacy that people have from the analytics and all of the tracking and targeting that these campaigns will be doing with all of these newfound funds that they have. Do we have any sorts of rights to prevent being advertised against?
Yeah, advertised to or advertised against. I mean, it's a really fair question. It's a good question that I think I need to unpack a little bit. This notion that I think that the rights that you seek are the rights that you can get by representing that to the elected officials that might be able to regulate some of this. I will say a lot of this is the Wild West. This is not how things have been done for a long time. I do remember back in the 2000 election when it was mind-blowing that John McCain raised $1 million online. It was insane, unheard of, $1 million. And now they're doing $2 million in an hour after a debate. I mean, it's just, things have changed. The way that politics is financed and, and the way that politicians reach voters and interested parties has changed. I think that people talk about how your email lists, I mean, I can get 7 emails a day. I mean, I got one from George Clooney last week. It was pretty exciting. They want me to go join him in a mall, in Los Angeles. I can't afford it, and tickets, but no, I mean, things like that. You're like, can I just opt out of this? Because I know, and I think that there's going to have to be a level of, discussion, and I think they're not going to get it right for some time, and then they're going to see if those systems stop working for them because people tune out, then they're going to find another way.
Yeah, and I'd add too that there's a book that called More Awesome Than Money. A friend of mine wrote it about a year or two ago about these young kids from NYU, and they basically started challenging Facebook, and obviously to no avail. But they one of the points made in the book is how Facebook is really sort of like a contractual relationship. You get it for free, and you get to tell your friends that what you ate at the waiting area in the airport, and in exchange for that, they get all your details. And if you don't want them to get your details, it's sort of like TV, turn it off or get off the platform, And maybe what would happen over time is somebody would invent a platform that's more of a different kind of a contractual relationship, and they won't give up your details and your privacy and your usage and your patterns or whatever, right? And but advertisers buy that. That's the big value of Facebook. They study it and sort you into different compartments, and the advertisers know how to target you, right? So, it's if you don't like if you really value the benefits you get out of Facebook, it's going to be a hard thing to give up. I don't use it, frankly. So but I find it kind of, I think it's insane. I don't care what people are eating at the airport, but anyway.
All right, I have a student question here for Mary. Could you briefly summarize why the Scoutist descent was so funny? I think you mentioned that in here.
I really can't summarize it really succinctly, except that you can imagine how you could make a lot of jokes about corporations being persons. And so that's what the humor centered around.
And some of the dissenting justices are really witty. And they just have a way with words. It's worth reading.
All right, thanks. Next question is, can we distinguish between money spent supporting a candidate in an election and money spent paying lobbyists? Is one of those categories more important, more influential, more effective than the other? So it sounds like the distinction between the election campaigning or lobbyist money spent. So
That's actually a comment that I wanted to make in reply to what you said. I think that we do need to separate out the spending for lobbying on positions and so forth from the concept of spending to influence the election. And I think most of us are halfway okay. We like for there to be a lot of disclosure and so forth, but we're halfway okay with the concept that yes, each group that we belong to, whether it's a nonprofit organization, a labor union, or whatever, should help us bring our issues to our elected representatives on a particular piece of legislation. And yes, it takes money to do that lobbying. But when it comes to the concept of those kinds of organizations spending huge amounts of money to influence our selection of candidates and to distort the positions of candidates, that's where most of us draw the line. That looks way too much like buying our votes, and it looks way too much like buying candidates.
I couldn't agree more with what Mary just said. It's this, you get this sort, and I'll go ahead and come out in full honesty. A lot of times lobbyists get branded with the scarlet L on their chest as being horrible, wretched people. I actually just completely disagree with that assertion. I think when you care about things that are important to you, I'll just give you, one example. Let's say you happen to care about solar energy. And right now, or at the end of last year, there's discussion as to whether or not this solar energy tax credit should be extended. Now, all you guys can't come up and fly on over and figure out how to talk to the tax writers who are going to maybe be extending it or not. But there's a group, there is a trade association that can give me all of the data points about solar energy in Colorado, in each congressional district. And I can call them and they can help me figure that out. That kind of information gathering and providing, and don't get me wrong, I don't just drink from the faucet. You have to sit there and look at, okay, explain to me, let me unpack this, make sure I know how many jobs is this, how many of these are indirect jobs, how many of them are direct jobs. You have to look at what the data actually is. But they play a really important role. But the other side of it is the sort of gross feeling that you get when you think about pay to play. You know, when you talk about lining up the meeting with the contribution or the breakfast that's being hosted the next day. And I think disclosure could help that a lot.
Also, I think that there's that disclosure already. There's plenty of times where a candidate or a challenger mines all that disclosed information for storylines that make the incumbent look like they're, playing for pay. They look at what the votes were and when they occurred relative to when the contributions came in, and who the contributions came from, how much of it was in-state, out-of-state, how much of it was directly related to their committee assignment. There's all kinds of ways to, parse that information, and sometimes it creates a narrative for a challenger to say, this is not what I'm going to do, and then it gives them an opening to create a daylight between the incumbent and the challenger.
Great. Another question we have, without disclosure, is there any way to know if money is from one of our foreign enemies? Anyone care to?
I think you need that, but you also need, if you're an enemy and you want to put money in politics, the way to find that out is you have to have some reason to investigate, and then you have to have subpoena authority to find out, to trace where the money came from, right?
And I'm certainly, I'm a tax person. I'm not a political contributions person, but I think it's illegal for foreign nationals to play in our system.
Yeah.
So if I were a super bundler or whatever, I'd probably be pretty stupid to take some money from one of them.
Yeah.
I think it's at their risk. That doesn't mean they're not doing it. All right, but if you know that that's not legal, one would hope that that's a fair amount of a deterrent. I would hope. But I know I'm with you, but I do think that then in that case, if that's our status quo, then I'm with you. We got to push for further disclosure and unpacking these bundles.
But 15 years ago, wasn't there a controversy involving a Chinese guy and Al Gore? How did that come out in public? There was some disclosure of something that caused, eyebrows to be raised, that led to an investigation, and all of a sudden you had a real controversy with money showing up in Gore's campaign coffers after some meeting, and this guy was sort of this mysterious guy, and it kind of went away eventually, but somehow, because of the disclosure requirements, it allowed, whether it was, I forget if it was investigators in the government or journalists who were doing this, to piece together a story, and it became a big deal.
But the bottom line to the question, answer to the question is that without disclosure, you don't know that. And, it is illegal and so forth, but without disclosure, for example, a foreign corporation might be a member of a trade association that has a PAC or something along that line. And so disclosure is the only way to know that.
Great, thanks. Let's go to the microphone.
Yes. There was a earlier topic called privatizing public services versus public interest, in which the speakers pointed out very poignantly to myself and the audience that there was a huge difference between profit groups, nonprofit groups, and government groups in terms of how they interacted and how they delivered services and so forth. It seemed to me when I went through this conference that the interactions were extremely complex, and to know what standards, what lobbyists, what worked, and so forth. Several of the speakers presently have suggested simple solutions to these complex problems. If we do truly have a military, industrial, congressional complex, should we be looking at the details of this complex in terms of how it functions, rather than the candidates advertising and BS?
So, think you guys got the gist of it?
Yeah. I think I did.
Okay, give it a go.
I think I picked up what you were putting down. I think am I right in saying this, that so I think I see the topic of this title is we can sort of discuss if this is little bit chicken and egg, right? We are talking about the tools or the use of mechanisms to put people in power that do these things that we are concerned with, that take votes for things on things we are concerned with that we may or may not believe in. And you're saying, can you dismantle it from the elected officials and the people that have already acted on this? You have candidates who haven't. They're not on the record here. And then you have elected officials who are on the record. And then the other way to say it is, why don't we just get a candidate in that won't do that or whatever? I obviously think I would agree with you 1,000% that heightened scrutiny needs to come from these industries that are providing a lot of providing a lot of financial support in our political system. But I mean, Mike was so right. It's everything. Mm-hmm. It is healthcare. It is foreign financial investment. It is transportation. It is energy. It is fossil fuels and renewable energy. All sides of it. I mean, we can trace all this money to the right places. But let's say, for example, there is a congressman from Houston, Texas, and the vast majority of his or her constituents are oil and gas company or employees. Let's make it clean, cut and dry. They actually work for this interest. All right, and he or she is on the record as having received money from an oil and gas company. Now, I don't know how I would parse that in my head. I think you could actually fully cut it two ways. The first way would be like, oh my God, these special interests, look at him. The other way would be, look at him, he's doing what he needs to do to represent jobs for his constituents. That nuance will carry through a lot of this conversation in all of those industries.
Yeah, and on that example, if you ran ads and said, Congressman so-and-so has accepted all this money from a special interest, the oil and gas industry, probably helps him or her in the district, right? Because there's going to be not just the, I think it was Gene Green maybe had an enormous number of oil and gas workers in his district in Texas. And I'm thinking, okay, how many households is that? Multiply the number of employees by households, and you're going to get 30,000 employees times another couple of people. So you may get, 1 out of 7 people, 1 out of 6 people in the district might be in that industry, and a lot of them vote. So you run an ad, unless there's a lot of people who are working for the Sierra Club down there. I think that's probably going to help them, not hurt them.
I'm getting a little depressed just thinking about this question and the potential answer to it, because there are those links in virtually every industry. We're used to tying it to the military complex, but absolutely every kind of industry, healthcare and oil and gas and so forth, lends itself to that, and yeah, it's a big problem.
Great. So this question will take us in a different direction. So Trump has demonstrated a variation on is anyone buying? That is, he's got an enormous bonus of free press. Just wondering your reactions to that and comments related to this topic on the use of free press and the different ways one may go about it.
Mm-hmm. It's not all good press, from what I can tell, for one thing. But you're right. This is the point, in a way, when you can run a campaign and average $27 contributions and then use the media to, whether it's in debates or whether it's in the various talk shows, to reach audiences. The flip is that, you have stations that are basically 24/7 news stations in theory, but, we look at some of the actual numbers of how many people view these shows. A lot of the shows are getting well under 100,000, 200,000 viewers nationwide. It's not, and if you're trying to target people in Wisconsin for some reason today, you may only get 500 of those 100,000 are going to be in Wisconsin or something. So the cable stations aren't the most effective. And so a lot of these local news stations, and they just don't have as many hours devoted to political news, much less news in general, right?
Yeah, it's I would probably take a step back from this question, and I'll speak on my own behalf, but this is a presidential election unlike any I have seen before. frankly. Okay, so this whole notion of the free press and the candidate just calling in every morning and saying, no, I didn't say that, but you can't see my face when I talk to you about it, and you can't see my facial expressions and things like that. And that sort of, where everyone else has to buy, commercial time, this guy doesn't. This to me is really new. And, what are the ramifications of it? We'll see. I mean, I think that there's a polarization that's happening here. But again, you guys are when you're subjected to this, who pays the price here? We do, with our own willingness to listen to politics, or our fed-upness with listening to politics. We pay for that.
So I'm going to go to microphone in a sec, but I have a partial question, so I'm hoping the person will type the meat of it. So I'll read what I have as far as the text that came through. And it's in the last session, you, and I'm assuming this is Mike, mentioned the identification of the wealthy class of Americans has shifted over time. Do you think that this shift is correlated to, and then that's all the question I have. So if you could send me that next part, because it sounds like it's leading someplace very interesting. And in the meantime, we'll go over here to the microphone, and if you've left the room, well, okay. So it is. I kept waiting for it to come through, and finally I just asked.
Some years ago, there was a movement whereby the federal government would finance national elections. Was that the topic of the recent Supreme Court measure that's been discussed, or is that still a possibility?
Explain the first part again. I'm sorry.
Well, there was a movement where the federal government would be the financer of elections. Mm-hmm. And again, I was wondering whether that was the basis of the Supreme Court decision of what's been talked about, or whether it still is a possibility.
My 2 cents is there's not a chance in the foreseeable future of Congress passing campaign finance legislation.
There is, did you say?
There's not.
No, thank you.
And given what's happened with the presidential fund, I would agree with that.
Yeah, and I think that the way Citizens United came out, I think it made it less likely for a partial or full conversion to publicly financed elections as compared to privately financed. It's an unfortunate reality, I think.
We have another question, and I think you all have spoke to it a little bit, but if you would elaborate a bit more on it, and it is this election season, and so it says, hasn't the fear of too much money from wealthy people in our election begun to deteriorate given the results of 2012 and the current national election, some of the phenomenons we're seeing? Is that an overstatement? What do you think it indicates? Give anybody hope?
I mean, I think this goes back to what Mike was saying. The money doesn't always equal efficacy, and you don't always buy what you think you're buying, and you may not buy exactly what you think you bought. That doesn't mean we don't stay vigilant and aware of where this money is going and who it's coming from. And just because it didn't work for Mitt Romney in 2012 doesn't mean it's not going to work this time. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, and then I think one of the topics we haven't quite talked about is Citizen United gives corporations the power of speech as money, but doesn't really speak to the responsibilities of people. So how do those relate, and how would you balance those out, or reactions to? I mean, that's kind of a lot of the gist of it, right? The difference between a person and a corporation and what their
There
responsibilities
might be some people here that would like to offer the death penalty to certain corporations. Change your views on the death penalty.
I think that's another panel.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that means, except doesn't mean corporations. How do they behave other than by having some kind of creating some kind of an employee pack, or I don't see how the corporation itself can be an active participant beyond what they're doing right now.
Well, I would maybe flip that on its back a little bit and say who are corporations beholden to? I think it's two parties. Number one, customers. Number two, shareholders. So there is a role for individuals in both of those capacities to sort of provide a check on Citizens United. But again, I think you have to have a very good concept of what kind of money is going where before you can activate that role.
Disclosure piece sounds like it comes back to.
Yeah, aren't there a lot of, now that I think of it, in shareholder meetings where shareholders have offered motions and resolutions and so on to try to get at some of this stuff, and I guess I'm not sure how many have ever succeeded, but they have a voice in theory, and I think a lot of the some of the pension funds that have large amounts of stakes in certain companies can vote their shares as a block if they're so inclined.
Okay, great. Any more questions from text or floor? All right, if not, I'll let you guys close out with, so give us a little hope. What can we, as the people sitting here in this room, take with us today? We've raised a lot of good issues, we've had some thorough discussion, and how might we move forward?
Shrink the government.
Okay, one side.
I will say something and on this one, I actually think I can speak as an expert, because 3 weeks ago in my subcommittee, we had a hearing on alternate forms of taxation, ways to replace in part or in whole our current income tax-based system. One of those was the fair tax, which is somewhat what you discussed. It's a two-tiered rate, 17% and 19%. And another one is the flat tax, and then there's the fair tax, which is a national retail sales tax. Now, let me just put this in perspective. On both of those, a component of both of those proposals is finding a way to ensure that our nation's poorest are not harmed. Because imagine if I'm making $10,000 a year and you're making $100,000 a year, the cost, the same chicken breast to you and to me, it's a bigger share of my income than it is of his, if we're each paying 23 cents on the dollar for the cost of that chicken breast. Okay, so taking this further on the fair tax, this 23% national sales tax rate. Number one, that rate is way low. We'll never sustain our current level of government, let alone the expanding baby boomer population, other entitlement obligations we have. So just setting that aside, in order to pay for a cash transfer to the nation's poorest, all right, and that was defined as a dollar amount up to the federal poverty line, which I think is $45,000 or roughly in that neighborhood for a family of four.
It's 24.
On an individual level?
For a family of four.
24?
It's like,
Okay. I think it's
in the teens for an individual.
Oh, okay. So we'll say 24. The cost of that is between $650 and $800 billion a year. And that is creating a brand new entitlement program that is sending checks out to people. So you might get simplification in your tax code. It's coming at you from somewhere else. And I would say that, coming from, I feel like I've been working on tax reform forever because we're always working on it. You can't, everyone's for tax reform, because if you're not, you're support defending our current code, which no one can do, okay? But that said, things are it's really complicated. And I think that we're doing, I think, some good work in the Ways and Means Committee to figure out where the pressure points are. But we got to start going back and the whole idea that, people can say, well, I can put your whole 1040 on the size of a postcard. I'm like, so is that like a really tiny font? Like, where do you staple the check? How do you send it in? There's, all these sort of, the rhetoric that goes with it belittles the size of the actual questions before us. But I will say the tax code is because it's one issue that it really does play very, very much into our political system and tax burdens and things like that. Touches everybody, including people that don't pay taxes. So I don't know if that's any good news or whatever, but we can start with we're working hard to fix the tax code. Still.
Well, my mantra, of course, is to vote. Encourage your friends to vote, your children to vote, your grandchildren if they're old enough. Everyone encourage them to vote, and then also hold your elected officials accountable after they get into office.
Great. And as your county clerk, I particularly like that message. I agree with that wholeheartedly. So please join me in thanking our fabulous panel, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you, guys. That was great. Good fun. Thanks for just rolling with all the technical, it's up, it's down, it's up.
Yeah.